Between the 16th and the 19th centuries, the world witnessed one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Millions of men, women, and children from the African continent were uprooted from their homes and carried across the vast Atlantic Ocean. It was not a journey of discovery or adventure, but one of fear, uncertainty, and unimaginable hardship. Imagine the shoreline of West Africa centuries ago, families torn apart, villages left in silence, and people bound together, not by choice, but by chains of circumstance that would forever change their lives. The journey across the ocean was long and unforgiving. The Atlantic, often called a bridge between worlds, became instead a passage of survival. Those who embarked on it faced crowded spaces, little food, and no comfort. It was not only the physical struggle of enduring harsh conditions but also the weight of leaving behind everything familiar, language, land, and loved ones. In this crossing, identities were stripped away, yet deep within, the spirit of resilience remained. For many, the ocean was both a grave and a symbol of endurance. When the ships reached the distant shores of the Americas, the people brought across the sea entered a completely foreign land. The sights, the sounds, the climate, even the crops were different from what they had ever known. And yet, from the very first moment, they were expected to work, to adapt, and to survive in a world designed to deny them freedom. Despite the cruel realities that awaited, what shines through history is not only the suffering but also the strength. These men and women carried with them traditions, songs, and stories, pieces of identity that no ocean or hardship could erase. This story is not simply about pain, it is also about endurance and humanity. It is about how people, even in the harshest of circumstances, found ways to hold on to hope, to pass down culture, and to whisper dreams of a better future. Today, when we revisit these histories, we are not just looking at numbers or statistics, we are listening to echoes of real lives, of people who once stood, hoped, and persevered. If you find value in uncovering hidden parts of history and want to journey deeper into the untold human stories that shaped our world, we invite you to join us. Like this video, share it with others who care about history, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can continue to explore the past, not just to remember it, but to learn from it, and to keep alive the voices of those who endured against all odds. The sound of iron striking iron echoed in the dim light, a cruel reminder that freedom had been replaced by confinement. Men, women, and children were fastened together, their movements restricted by the heavy weight of chains that bound wrist to wrist and ankle to ankle. Each step clattered like a reminder of captivity, stripping away dignity with every movement. For many, this was the first taste of a journey into the unknown, and the last glimpse of the homeland they once called their own. As they were forced below deck, the air grew thick and unkind. The wooden beams of the ship pressed low, creating a space that allowed no comfort and demanded silence. Bodies were pressed tightly together, shoulder against shoulder, so close that turning or stretching became impossible. The stifling heat and the absence of fresh air created a suffocating environment, where the simplest act of breathing felt like a struggle. In these cramped quarters, time stretched endlessly, measured not by the rising of the sun but by the creaking of the ship's boards and the rolling of waves against the hull. Food, when offered, came in small, meager portions, never enough to satisfy the hunger that gnawed at empty stomachs. Many could not swallow what little they were given, the weight of despair often took away the will to eat. Dehydration parched lips and dried throats, leaving only exhaustion and weakness behind. The human body, deprived of nourishment and comfort, grew frail, and one by one, the faint glow of strength dimmed in many who had once been vibrant and strong. But physical deprivation was only part of the suffering. Every day, the sounds of anguish filled the stale air, groans of illness, the quiet sobs of those missing their loved ones, and the whispers of prayers to familiar gods, carried softly so as not to draw attention. Each voice told a story, of a family torn apart, of children separated from mothers, of futures cut short before they had even begun. Beneath the deck, grief lingered in every corner, heavier than the wood and iron that encased them. Disease crept quickly through these spaces, an invisible foe that claimed life after life. Without fresh air or sanitation, the spread was relentless. A cough in the dark became a warning, fever was often a death sentence. With each passing day, the number of those who could no longer endure grew larger. For many, the ocean itself became their final resting place, their stories ending in silence beneath the waves. Yet, even in such despair, the spirit of resistance flickered. Some whispered to one another in secret, sharing fragments of home, songs remembered from distant villages, words in a language forbidden, memories that anchored them to an identity greater than their suffering. In those hushed exchanges, there was a quiet defiance, a refusal to let hardship erase the essence of who they were. The emotional toll was immense. Imagine lying in the darkness, the ship rocking endlessly, not knowing what awaited at journey's end. The unknown weighed heavier than the chains. Each person carried questions that no one could answer. Would they ever see their homeland again? Would they survive to feel the sun without the shadow of captivity? In that uncertainty, some found strength in hope, while others, overwhelmed by despair, sought an escape in silence that could not be undone. The voyage across the ocean was not merely a physical passage, it was a crossing into another world, one designed to strip away freedom, identity, and heritage. Yet, despite every cruelty, resilience endured. Some survived, carrying with them stories that would one day be told to future generations. Their survival was not just endurance of hardship, it was a testament to an unbroken spirit. This part of history reminds us of the strength of the human will in the face of overwhelming darkness. It was a journey meant to erase individuality, but instead, it revealed resilience that could not be extinguished. Through memory, through storytelling, and through history, those voices continue to speak, not of defeat, but of survival. And as we listen, we carry forward their legacy, ensuring that their endurance is never forgotten. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the horizon, but for those bound to the rhythm of the fields, the day had already begun. Before the rooster's crow faded into silence, footsteps stirred across the dirt paths, heavy with fatigue from the night before. Sleep had been short, stolen in fragments, and the body longed for rest. Yet the fields waited, endless rows of white stretching out like a sea without end, demanding labor from the moment the sun broke the sky. With tools in hand, men and women stepped into the cotton fields as the world around them was still waking. The air at sunrise carried a brief coolness, a fleeting comfort soon swallowed by the weight of the southern heat. Each stalk had to be tended, each branch stripped carefully, fingers raw and worn from repeated motion. The work was not optional, it was survival. The pace was relentless, set not by the body's strength but by the overseer's watchful eye. As the morning gave way to noon, the heat became merciless. The sun bore down without compassion, turning the fields into an open furnace. Sweat drenched clothes and stung tired eyes, but the labor did not slow. Every hand remained busy, plucking, dragging, carrying, because even the slightest pause could invite punishment. The sound of cicadas hummed in the background, but over it all came the steady rhythm of toil, the rustle of cotton, the scrape of hose against soil, the labored breathing of those who worked without pause. When a break finally came, it was brief and insufficient, a moment measured not in relief but in urgency. A sip of water, a bite of cornbread or salted meat, enough to quiet the hunger but never to satisfy it. In that fleeting respite, workers glanced at one another, sharing silent recognition of their shared exhaustion. Then, as quickly as it arrived, the moment ended, and the long march through the hours continued. Evening offered no release. As shadows stretched and the fields fell into darkness, the day's labor was not yet done. Cotton baskets had to be carried and weighed, their contents judged against strict expectations. Any shortcoming meant fear, any excess meant tomorrow's demand would only rise higher. The weight of judgment lingered heavier than the baskets themselves. After the fields, there were still chores awaiting. Chopping wood, tending to livestock, fetching water, mending tools, preparing meager meals, tasks that filled the hours when the body cried out for rest. Candlelight flickered in cabins as weary hands continued their work, sewing torn clothes or patching worn shoes. Children, too, played their part, carrying smaller loads or helping prepare the next day's necessities. The cycle left little space for laughter or leisure, even the night carried its burdens. Exhaustion became a constant companion. By the time the moon rose high above the fields, many collapsed onto rough bedding, bodies aching, muscles trembling from the unending strain. Yet sleep was never deep. Minds remained alert, haunted by the knowledge that dawn would bring the same routine, as predictable and unyielding as the rising sun. But within this unbroken pattern, small sparks of resilience endured. In the quiet of the night, voices sometimes rose in hushed melodies, songs carried softly through the darkness, weaving hope into rhythm. These songs spoke of faith, of longing, of dreams that reached beyond the fields. They were reminders that even in the harshest conditions, spirit could not be entirely broken. The cycle of labor in the southern fields was more than just physical exertion, it was a system designed to exhaust both body and will. Yet what history remembers is not only the grueling hours beneath the sun, but also the endurance that lived within those who endured them. Each sunrise brought the same demand, yet each sunset bore witness to survival. It was a life dictated by the fields, but not entirely defined by them. For beneath the weight of endless work, the human spirit found ways to endure, to resist, and to carry forward a legacy of strength that no amount of labor could erase. The fields were not governed by the rising and setting of the sun alone. They were ruled by another presence, one that carried authority not through kindness, but through fear. The overseer, with sharp eyes and an unyielding stance, moved along the rows of cotton as if every plant, every worker, and every breath belonged to him. His purpose was not only to measure labor but to ensure absolute obedience. Quotas hung over the heads of those in the fields like an invisible chain. Each basket of cotton had to meet a weight, each day's yield had to reach a target. The numbers were not suggestions, they were laws. Too little, and suspicion rose, too much, and tomorrow's expectation would only grow higher. Workers lived in the narrow space between exhaustion and fear, knowing that every stalk they touched was a test of survival. The overseer's presence amplified that fear. A shadow could fall across a worker's back at any moment, a reminder that someone was always watching. Even when bodies trembled from fatigue or fingers bled from the sharp burrs of cotton, there was no room for slowing down. To falter was to risk punishment, and punishment was designed not only to cause pain but to send a message: no disobedience would go unnoticed. When resistance appeared, even in its smallest forms, the response was swift. A pause in labor, a whispered word, a sideways glance, any of these could be interpreted as defiance. And defiance, in the overseer's eyes, demanded an example be made. Workers saw what happened when rules were broken. The sight of a neighbor dragged away, the echo of cries carried on the wind, or the mark left on someone's body, these were lessons meant for everyone to absorb. Some were forced into restraints, iron heavy on their wrists and ankles, a burden that mocked the very idea of freedom. Others bore marks etched into their skin, reminders that the system claimed ownership not only of their time and labor but of their very bodies. The cruelty was not random, it was calculated. It was a theater of control, performed again and again so that no one would forget the consequences of stepping out of line. Yet, even under such control, the human will remained. Workers learned to mask their resistance. Instead of open defiance, they chose subtler paths, moving slower without appearing to stop, hiding strength behind fatigue, or finding ways to damage tools and crops without drawing attention. These small acts carried risk, but they also carried meaning, they proved that spirit could endure, even in silence. The overseer's punishments were intended to erase individuality, to reduce each person to nothing more than a number in the field. But paradoxically, the memory of those punishments often fueled solidarity. When one suffered, others carried the weight of that suffering in their hearts. Whispers spread, not of fear alone, but of quiet determination to endure together. The very tools of oppression became a reminder that the struggle was shared. Stories of those who endured punishment passed through the cabins at night. Around flickering candles, workers told of the strong who had borne the overseer's wrath and still found the courage to rise again at dawn. These stories did more than recount pain, they celebrated resilience. In the harshest of conditions, remembering survival became an act of defiance in itself. The system of control was relentless, but it could never fully silence the human desire for freedom. The overseer may have held authority in the fields, but he could not touch the songs sung under the breath, the prayers whispered in the dark, or the dreams carried in silence. These were the places where no quota could reach, where no punishment could erase what lived in the soul. In time, the overseer's power became a symbol of both cruelty and resistance. His presence reminded everyone of the dangers of defiance, but it also highlighted the bravery of those who still found ways to resist. The scars left on the body were undeniable, but the strength that endured within was far greater. History remembers not the overseer's authority, but the courage of those who, despite everything, continue to rise each morning and step into the fields with a spirit that could not be broken. Resistance took many forms, and it rarely looked the same from one day to the next. In a world where every action was monitored, where each step could invite suspicion, defiance was often quiet, subtle, and carefully hidden beneath the surface of daily routine. Yet, even under the watchful eyes of those who claimed authority, people found ways to push back against the system that tried to erase their humanity. Sometimes resistance was disguised as weariness. A slowed pace in the fields, a hand that lingered too long over a stalk of cotton, or a tool that seemed to break a little too easily, these were small acts, almost invisible, yet powerful in their intention. They disrupted the rhythm of forced labor, giving workers even a moment's relief, and served as reminders that not every movement could be controlled. In other cases, defiance took the shape of sabotage. Tools might be left in disrepair, crops quietly damaged, or livestock allowed to stray. These acts risked punishment, but they also chipped away at the illusion of total control. Each disruption, however small, sent a message: the people in the fields were not passive, and their labor could not be taken for granted. Literacy became another form of rebellion. In places where education was forbidden, the act of learning to read or write was both dangerous and revolutionary. A scrap of paper, a whispered lesson by candlelight, a message passed secretly from one person to another, these were steps toward empowerment. Reading opened doors to knowledge, and knowledge meant the possibility of change. To master the written word was to claim a power that the system sought to deny. There were also those who resisted through acts of survival that might seem simple, yet carried immense risk. Taking food to feed a starving child, holding back supplies, or quietly claiming what was denied, all of these were ways to reclaim dignity in a world that tried to strip it away. Each loaf of bread, each piece of clothing, each hidden object was more than a possession, it was a statement that life and self-worth could not be completely stolen. Some sought freedom beyond the boundaries of the plantation. The decision to escape was not made lightly, for it meant facing forests, rivers, dogs, and men determined to hunt them down. Yet countless individuals chose that path, guided by courage and the hope of liberty. Many followed the stars, others relied on secret networks of allies, and some found sanctuary in communities that sheltered them. Each escape attempt, whether successful or not, stood as proof of a desire for something greater than the chains of forced labor. There were also darker acts of resistance, born from despair but rooted in the determination not to be broken. Some chose to harm themselves rather than allow their bodies to be treated as property. Others made decisions that robbed their oppressors of control over life itself. These were acts of ultimate defiance, painful to imagine, yet deeply human in their insistence on agency, even in the harshest of circumstances. At times, resistance erupted openly, with courage that could not be hidden. Groups rose together, weapons in hand, striking against those who held power. Though such uprisings were often met with brutal suppression, their impact rippled far beyond the moment. They ignited fear in those who believed they ruled without challenge, and they gave inspiration to others who longed for freedom. Rebellion, whether large or small, declared that submission was never absolute. Even in the quietest nights, when cabins were dimly lit and bodies weary from labor, the spirit of defiance lived on. Songs carried hidden meanings, prayers wove hope into each word, and stories passed from elder to child kept alive the memory of a life before bondage. These acts of cultural survival were themselves resistance, preserving identity in the face of erasure. The story of resistance is not only one of conflict, but of resilience. It is the story of countless individuals who, in ways both small and great, refused to surrender the essence of who they were. Whether through the breaking of a tool, the sharing of a secret word, the quiet planning of an escape, or the raising of a hand in open defiance, each act spoke loudly of a truth the system could not silence: the human spirit cannot be fully subdued. History remembers not only the chains, but also the courage. It remembers the subtle movements that went unseen, the knowledge passed in secret, the journeys into the unknown, and the moments of bravery that shook the foundations of oppression. Resistance was not an exception, it was a constant current, flowing through every life, shaping a legacy of strength that still echoes through time. Solomon Northup's words, preserved in his memoir 12 Years a Slave, paint a picture of life lived under an unending shadow. His story was not only about chains or the labor in the fields, it was about the constant pressure of expectations that no human could truly meet. Day after day, from the first light of dawn until nightfall, every moment was measured, every action weighed against the demands of an unforgiving system. The cotton fields were not merely places of work, they were arenas of survival. Each stalk that had to be picked, each basket that had to be filled, carried with it a silent threat. Meeting the daily quota was never enough, for the bar always shifted, climbing higher as if designed to break both body and spirit. The fear was not only of exhaustion, but of what would follow if the basket came up too light, or if the pace faltered before the overseer's watchful eyes. Northup described the sound of the weighing scales as a moment of dread. Workers approached them with trembling hands, knowing that their fate could be decided in that instant. A basket just shy of expectation meant more than disappointment, it meant danger. The scales became symbols of judgment, more feared than any words. To stand before them was to feel the weight not only of cotton but of one's very existence. Punishment was always close, an ever-present possibility. It loomed like a storm on the horizon, ready to break without warning. The threat alone was often enough to push bodies past their limits, to wring out the last ounce of strength when muscles had already given way. And when punishment did come, it was not only the individual who felt its sting, it echoed through the entire group, a warning to all who dared to fall short. Northup wrote not simply of pain but of the psychology of fear. It was fear that drove the endless labor, fear that silenced voices, fear that crept into every corner of daily life. Even at night, when the fields lay quiet, the mind could not rest. Tomorrow's quota hung in the air like a curse, robbing sleep of its peace. The next day was always waiting, always demanding, and always threatening. Yet within his account there was also resilience. Northup did not surrender to despair, though the system sought to strip away every fragment of hope. He endured, observing, remembering, and holding on to the fragments of his identity that could not be stolen. His words, written years later, were themselves acts of defiance, proof that the human spirit could outlast the cruelty designed to erase it. The quotas, brutal as they were, revealed the impossible nature of the system. No matter how much was picked, no matter how heavy the baskets grew, it was never truly enough. This cycle of demand and punishment exposed the deep injustice of a world that valued production over humanity. Northup's story pulled back the curtain, allowing future generations to see not only the physical hardships but the psychological torment of living under constant surveillance and impossible expectations. He also showed the small victories hidden in daily life. There were moments when workers managed to support one another, lifting spirits with words of encouragement, sharing food, or simply standing together in silent solidarity. These acts may not have broken the system, but they preserved dignity in a place where dignity was constantly under attack. Northup's memoir is more than a personal story, it is a testimony. It is the voice of someone who lived through the relentless grind of quotas and punishments, who felt the weight of fear pressing down with every passing day, and who still found the strength to tell the world what he saw. His words carry echoes of countless others who endured but whose stories were never written down. To read 12 Years a Slave is to step into that world of endless labor and ever-present fear, but it is also to witness the endurance of the human soul. The quotas, the punishments, the scales of judgment, all of these were real and devastating. Yet the story did not end there. Northup lived to reclaim his freedom, to put pen to paper, and to make sure that the truth would not be buried in silence. His memoir reminds us that even in the darkest of times, memory can become a form of resistance. By telling his story, he ensured that the voices of the past would continue to speak, carrying lessons of both suffering and strength into the future. In the summer of 1831, in the rural landscape of Southampton County, Virginia, a man named Nat Turner prepared to act on a vision he believed was divinely inspired. Turner was no ordinary figure among the enslaved community. He was a preacher, a man who carried a reputation for deep spirituality and a quiet intensity. To those who knew him, he was someone who read meaning in signs and symbols, who believed that the events of the world were woven into a larger plan. For years, Turner had lived under the weight of bondage, working the fields, enduring the daily indignities, and watching the suffering of those around him. But he also nurtured within himself a conviction that he had been chosen for something greater. He believed he was called to strike against the system that sought to keep his people in chains. Visions of rebellion haunted his nights, filling his mind with images of a future where freedom was no longer a dream but a reality. When the time came, Turner did not hesitate. He gathered a small group of trusted companions, men who shared both his faith and his desperation. Armed with little more than resolve and what weapons they could find, they moved under the cover of night. Their mission was not just to escape, but to shatter the world that had oppressed them for generations. The uprising began suddenly and with fury. Turner and his men struck swiftly, moving from house to house. In the chaos, more than 60 white men, women, and children lost their lives. The rebellion spread fear like wildfire, shaking the foundations of a society that had long believed itself unshakable. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Turner's vision might spread wider, igniting the flames of liberation across the South. But the rebellion was met with swift and overwhelming force. Local militias, armed and determined, marched against Turner and his followers. The uprising was crushed within days. The men who had joined him were captured, tried, and executed. Turner himself eluded capture for weeks, hiding in the woods, surviving on roots and berries. Yet even as he evaded his pursuers, the net around him grew tighter. When he was finally discovered, weakened but unbroken, he faced trial with a calm that startled those who judged him. Turner's execution was meant to silence him, to erase his defiance from memory. But his rebellion had already left a scar that could not be hidden. Fear rippled through the South. Slaveholders, terrified that other uprisings might follow, demanded stricter laws and harsher punishments. The freedoms of both enslaved and free black people were curtailed even further. Education was suppressed, movement restricted, and suspicion fell heavily on anyone who dared show signs of resistance. Yet in trying to extinguish the fire Turner had lit, the system revealed its greatest weakness, fear. The rebellion had proven that beneath the silence of the fields, anger simmered, waiting for a moment to rise. Turner's revolt may have ended in bloodshed, but it shattered the illusion that bondage was unchallenged or unresisted. It forced the South to confront the reality that those it sought to control were not passive, and that the desire for freedom burned fiercely in every heart. In the years that followed, Turner's story became both legend and warning. To those in power, it was told as a tale of terror, a justification for ever-tightening restrictions. But among the enslaved, it lived on as a testament to courage. Whispers of his name carried hope, proof that one man's conviction could shake an entire system. Nat Turner's uprising remains one of the most significant moments of resistance in American history. It was not merely an act of violence, it was a declaration that the human spirit, when pushed beyond its limits, would rise up and fight back, no matter the cost. Turner may have lost his life, but his defiance echoed through generations, reminding the world that freedom is a force that cannot be permanently subdued. The rebellion of 1831 was crushed, but the memory of it endured. And in that memory lived both a warning and a promise, a warning to those who sought to preserve oppression at any cost, and a promise to those who still dreamed of liberty, that even in the darkest of nights, resistance could find a way to rise. Imagine a row of small wooden cabins standing at the edge of a sprawling plantation, their outlines barely visible in the pale light of dawn. These were not homes in the true sense of the word, but crude shelters hastily built to house those who labored in the fields. The walls were rough, the roofs leaky, and the floors were nothing more than packed dirt that turned to dust in summer and to mud in the rains. Inside, space was scarce. Entire families, sometimes parents, children, and even extended kin, crowded together in a single room. Privacy was a luxury no one could claim. The thin wooden walls offered no barrier against sound, no escape from the constant press of bodies. At night, the air grew heavy, filled with the breathing of too many people in too little space. For bedding, there were no mattresses or feathered quilts, only piles of straw, scraps of cloth, or whatever could be gathered to soften the hardness of the ground. The cabins bore the marks of hardship, but within them, life still unfolded. Mothers cradled infants and tried to soothe them against the cries of hunger. Fathers returned from the fields carrying exhaustion in their bones but offering what strength they could to their loved ones. Children played in the dust outside, creating games out of sticks and stones, their laughter rising above the harshness that surrounded them. In these fragile spaces, families tried to stitch together moments of love and belonging, even as the system around them worked tirelessly to pull them apart. The greatest wound was not the lack of comfort, but the constant threat of separation. Families lived each day under the shadow of uncertainty, knowing that at any moment a child, a husband, or a wife could be taken away. The sound of footsteps at the cabin door could mean the breaking of bonds that no heart could truly mend. Parents taught their children to remember names, faces, and kin, for fear that one day memory would be all that tied them together. Even in these dire conditions, people found ways to resist despair. Songs were sung in the dim light, voices weaving together in melodies that carried both sorrow and hope. These songs were more than music, they were a way to endure, to keep alive stories and faith, to remind each other that they were more than laborers in a field. In whispered words and quiet prayers, they preserved a sense of identity that could not be stripped away by walls of wood or floors of dirt. Food was scarce, and meals were often meager. Cornmeal, molasses, or scraps were shared among many mouths. Yet within these limitations, families showed resourcefulness, stretching what little they had, turning simple ingredients into nourishment. Sometimes, gardens were planted near the cabins, small plots of earth where vegetables could grow, providing both sustenance and a rare sense of ownership. The cabins themselves told a story of resilience. Though they were built to confine, the people inside transformed them into places of connection. They repaired the cracks in the walls, patched roofs with whatever materials they could find, and decorated their spaces with small tokens, perhaps a carved wooden figure, a scrap of cloth, or a cherished object passed from hand to hand. These acts, though simple, were declarations of humanity in a world that sought to deny it. At night, when the fields lay quiet and the overseer's watchful eye had dimmed with the setting sun, the cabins became places of community. Neighbors visited one another, sharing stories and songs, finding strength in the presence of their peers. Around small fires, elders told tales of faraway homelands, keeping alive the memory of places most would never see again. Children listened with wide eyes, their imaginations carrying them beyond the confines of their reality. And still, there was always the fear of loss. Each morning, as the sun rose, families faced the possibility that this day might be their last together. The bonds of kinship were strong, but they were constantly tested by forces beyond their control. Some families were torn apart forever, while others clung to hope, waiting for the day when they might be reunited. The cabins with dirt floors, the overcrowding, the absence of privacy, all of these were markers of hardship. But within those walls, life persevered. Love endured, hope flickered, and resilience took root in even the harshest soil. Though the cabins stood as symbols of deprivation, the people who lived in them transformed them into sanctuaries of memory, connection, and strength. Their story is not just one of suffering, it is also one of endurance. In the face of hardship, families found ways to live, to love, and to remember. And even when separation came, the memory of these crude shelters carried with it the echoes of laughter, the warmth of shared meals, and the resilience of a people who refused to let their spirit be broken. Inside the grand houses of the American South, life unfolded in a very different rhythm from the fields, yet it carried its own heavy burdens. For those who served as domestic workers, the day began before the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon and often did not end until long after darkness had settled. Their world was not the open expanse of cotton rows or tobacco fields, but the narrow, confining spaces of kitchens, parlors, and nurseries. These workers lived under the constant watch of the families they served. They were responsible for preparing meals from early morning until late at night, cleaning every corner of the house, tending to laundry, polishing silver, maintaining fires, and caring for the children. From the smallest tasks, fetching water, sweeping floors, dusting shelves, to the larger responsibilities of planning meals and sewing clothes, their hands were always busy. The sound of footsteps echoing down polished hallways often meant another demand, another order, another chore waiting to be done. Childcare was one of the most intimate and exhausting duties. Domestic workers often spent more time with the children of the household than the parents themselves did. They carried babies on their hips while stirring pots of food, rocked cradles in the late hours of the night, soothed fevers, and told bedtime stories. Many of the children formed deep attachments to these caretakers, relying on them for comfort and affection. Yet, despite the bonds that naturally grew, these relationships existed within a painful imbalance of power. The same individuals who nurtured children with tenderness were often denied the opportunity to raise their own, their families separated or left behind. The life of a domestic worker was relentless. Unlike field workers, whose labor ended with the setting sun, domestic duties followed the household clock. If guests arrived late in the evening, the workers stayed awake to serve them. If a child awoke crying at midnight, it was the worker who rose to soothe them. The demands never truly ceased, and moments of rest were fleeting. Living inside the house meant being on call every hour of the day, always ready to respond to the ring of a bell or the sound of a commanding voice. Yet, the weight of this life extended beyond physical exhaustion. Domestic workers lived in close proximity to those who held authority over them, navigating a world where they were constantly vulnerable to mistreatment. They endured scolding words, harsh criticisms, and endless scrutiny. Every movement was judged, every mistake amplified. Even the smallest misstep, a dish broken, a garment scorched by the fire, could bring punishment or humiliation. Perhaps the most difficult reality was the constant erosion of personal dignity. Workers had little privacy, often sleeping in cramped quarters near kitchens or at the foot of staircases so they could be summoned at a moment's notice. Their lives were not their own, their time, their energy, their very presence belonged to the household they served. And while they cared for the children and tended to the most private details of the family's daily life, they themselves were denied the simple security of protecting their own boundaries. Despite all of this, domestic workers displayed remarkable resilience. They found quiet ways to preserve their humanity within an environment designed to strip it away. Songs hummed softly while rocking a cradle carried echoes of traditions passed down through generations. Small acts of resistance, working a little slower, taking an extra moment to rest, or quietly teaching a child a song from a distant homeland, were ways of asserting identity. Even in silence, they held on to pieces of themselves that could not be erased. The kitchen, though a place of endless labor, sometimes became a sanctuary of sorts. It was here that recipes were passed down, food prepared with both skill and creativity, and flavors preserved from cultures nearly lost to time. In these acts of cooking, workers wove pieces of their heritage into the meals that graced the tables of the very families who claimed ownership over them. Food, in this way, became both survival and subtle defiance. Stories, too, were preserved. In the quiet of the night, after the household had finally gone to sleep, workers whispered tales to one another, stories of ancestors, of faraway lands, of faith and freedom. These narratives carried hope, a reminder that their lives were more than the endless tasks assigned to them. They were a way to remember, to resist, and to dream of a life beyond servitude. The world of the domestic worker was complex. It was filled with contradictions, moments of tenderness alongside moments of deep pain, the warmth of caring for children alongside the coldness of being denied one's own family. They lived in the shadows of grand houses, invisible to the outside world, yet essential to their functioning. Every polished floor, every neatly folded garment, every child's smile bore the mark of their labor. Their story is not only one of hardship but also of survival and resilience. Despite the closeness of their oppressors, despite the relentless demands and the stripping away of privacy, they carried within them a strength that could not be extinguished. In kitchens, nurseries, and servant quarters, they preserved fragments of culture, dignity, and humanity. And through their endurance, they remind us of the power of resilience in even the most confining of circumstances. When the year 1808 arrived, a turning point was marked in history. The transatlantic trade that had carried so many across the ocean was brought to an official end in the United States. But this did not bring freedom, nor did it lessen the demand for labor in the fields and plantations that continued to expand across the South. Instead, the system adapted. What had once been fueled by ships crossing from distant shores now shifted inward, creating a vast network of buying and selling within the country itself. Families became the heart of this new system, but not in the way we think of family as a place of comfort or stability. For countless men, women, and children, family ties became fragile threads at the mercy of markets. Children were born into lives not of their choosing, their futures already determined from the moment they took their first breath. Parents faced the constant fear that their sons and daughters might be taken away, sold to distant places, or carried into unfamiliar lands where their voices would be lost among strangers. The cities of the South became bustling centers of this internal trade. Among them, New Orleans rose to prominence. Its streets, lively with commerce and activity, masked a hidden reality. Behind the markets, the auctions, and the contracts lay the stories of lives being reshaped against their will. Traders, buyers, and sellers treated people as part of a system of exchange, while those caught within it carried the quiet pain of separation and uncertainty. Imagine the scene, a crowded marketplace, voices calling out prices, papers signed and sealed, and within it all, individuals standing silently, their futures being decided in a matter of minutes. For many, this moment meant leaving everything familiar behind, homes, parents, siblings, friends. It meant being carried away into the unknown. These were not just transactions of economy, they were turning points in lives, where paths diverged and connections were broken. The expansion of this internal system reshaped the South in profound ways. Plantations grew larger, cities thrived on the commerce, and entire regions became dependent on the cycle of buying and selling. Behind the statistics and the numbers, however, were countless personal stories, of love, of loss, of resilience. Mothers held their children a little tighter, fathers taught lessons in whispered words, and communities tried to weave together strength even as they were pulled apart. What endures from this time is not only the record of markets or laws but also the unbreakable human spirit that survived within it. Even when freedom was denied, even when families were torn asunder, people found ways to preserve memory, culture, and hope. Songs were sung that carried the weight of longing and the promise of tomorrow. Stories passed from parent to child kept alive the knowledge that identity could not be erased, no matter how powerful the system seemed. As we reflect on this history, it becomes clear that the true story is not just about markets, cities, or plantations, it is about people. People who endured hardship but refused to let their humanity be lost. People who carried traditions across generations, ensuring that even in the darkest times, light was never fully extinguished. Their legacy lives on, reminding us that resilience is as much a part of history as suffering, and that hope has always found a way to endure. By remembering these stories, we honor not only the struggles but also the strength of those who came before. We learn that history is not a distant tale, but a mirror that reflects what people can survive, and how dignity can persist against all odds. If you found meaning in this journey through the past, we invite you to support our channel. Like this video, share it with others who want to uncover the deeper layers of history, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story we bring to life. Thank you for joining us tonight, and until we meet again, we wish you a peaceful and restful good night.